Presently, he is doing his PhD from TIFR. Today, he is talking about not conforming to a state granular material, the eternal rebel. Requesting every listener, please mute your microphone and turn off your videos. If you have any question, then please write it in the chat box or raise your hand. I will take those questions after finishing the talk. Thank you. Over to Shobtanuda.
Thank you very much for your invitation. I'll start my talk now. You may see my title is a bit of a flashy title. I won't go into why I chose it to be such. I'll just let you know that it was a honest choice on my part. Before I begin though, I would like to thank some people who were instrumental to this presentation coming about. I'd like to thank my PI, Professor Shankar Ghosh, for his inputs. When I initially agreed to give the talk, I had a very different idea about what this presentation would be. And after talking to him and getting a few things cleared out, it became quite a different thing. I hope that most of you understand what I'm talking about. And if I say something too complicated or if I say something that's not clear, please stop me and ask me what I'm talking about. I'd also like to thank a few of my friends who helped me to come up with the title of this talk, especially Atreyo, Titir, and Shorodip. Let's start somewhere simple. What is my plan? Well, to be exact, I don't really have a plan. And this is pretty good advice. But I do have some kind of a blueprint. I just want to share some things about granular physics with you all. Some things that I learned while I was doing my research here at TIFR, things that surprised me, and things that initially seemed counterintuitive, but later on I realized that it was only because I was not paying attention to the whole problem. So let's start somewhere very simple. You all know the model of the ideal gas. The ideal gas is
Hello?
a very used, yes.
Can you please turn on your video? Someone is saying that you can video on and talk.
Yeah, Shushantika, I think Shottanu, do whatever you feel comfortable with.
Yes.
It's not
Okay.
necessary. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Shushantika. Yes, I saw that. Yeah, thank you.
All right, I don't have a problem as such. My camera is a bit of a weird angle, so you might see my face in a weird way.
Okay.
Anyways, let's start simple. We'll start with the model of an ideal gas. You studied this in high school, in your thermodynamics classes, in your statistical mechanics classes, because this is a very good model and it can help us understand a lot of phenomena that's happening around us. Let's start with a very simple example. I have a container which is split into two portions by a partition, and in one side of the partition I have a gas at some higher pressure or density, and on another side a slightly lower density or pressure. So this number of particles just indicates that. I now remove this partition, and then now the gas will mix, and at a steady state an uniform density will be present throughout the whole box. Again, this is what we understand, and this seems logical because this is what happens when a gas is kept in a container. It expands till it occupies the whole volume with more or less a uniform density. This is important. The other kind of phenomena that we see is that if the two partitions had a hotter gas and a colder gas, the color represents their temperature. I again open up the partition, the gases are allowed to mix, and at a steady state, you get a gas with more or less a uniform temperature. And this again seems logical because this seems to be what we observe every day. Now, keep this in mind. What we are seeing, what I'm talking about the steady state is, I'm referring to thermal equilibrium. The system inherently wants to go to thermal equilibrium, and this is helped by the fact of the thermal fluctuations, like the energy kBT. This energy allows the gases to be, or the atoms you might say, to visit each of their microstates available. And since all possible microstates have been visited with their corresponding weights, you see average properties depending on the weight of each microstate. Now, in an ideal gas, the energy transfer between particles are taking place via collisions. We consider that the gases are made of hard spheres and the collisions are elastic. And this helps us get to our equation of state. I will make one small change. I will say that what if the collisions were inelastic? What if some amount of energy was lost per collision? What would we expect? For simplicity, I have come across a simulation that I would like to show you. So you start with a uniform density of gas, which that is why the whole screen looks full of color, and you let collisions happen and the gas now evolves. If it was an ideal gas, this color would remain constant throughout. But watch closely what happens. Some spots get brighter, some spots get darker, corresponding to higher density and lower density. A gas that was at uniform density is now going to areas of higher density and lower density. This would not have been possible in an ideal gas. In an ideal gas, a uniform density would remain at a uniform density with certain amount of noise. But here we see large chunks forming, clumps forming, large areas of very large density, areas of very small density. Now, those of you who are aware of what's happening will already know the answer. But let me point out to you what exactly happened. Now, I added dissipation. Because of dissipation, the atoms can no longer visit all of their microstates. The energy loss prevents them. Because of this system is no longer able to reach thermal equilibrium. We are now dealing with a non-equilibrium system. And because it's a non-equilibrium system, you can see many things which would not be possible at equilibrium. So you keep this in mind. Most of the things that we learn in our undergrad, and me as well, we tend to learn about systems which are near equilibrium or at equilibrium or coming to equilibrium. I am now going to talk about systems which are inherently not at equilibrium. And these systems are extremely dissipative, and so they need a lot of energy from outside to reach equilibrium. And that gives interesting effects. So if it initially seems counterintuitive to you, something seems weird, just ask yourself this. Is it counterintuitive because it is weird, or is it because I'm thinking about equilibrium processes and this is not equilibrium process? This is the first thing that I learned to ask myself when I was dealing with this field of research. I'll show you a small video of an experiment. So here we have a container full of gas and a separator in the middle. And this, as we saw, because of dissipation, I need to give some kind of energy to keep the molecules moving. In this case, these are small beads which are being made to move by moving the plunger, this black plunger. This black plunger up and down. See what happens. You see, this goes against the two examples of the ideal gas I showed you in the first two slides. A hotter gas is going into a colder gas, and a region of smaller particles are moving from a region of low density to a region of high density. And this is only possible because of dissipation. As the number of particles increase, the number of collisions increase, the rate of energy loss increases, and hence a colder region becomes even more colder, and a hotter region becomes even more hotter. So this is a macroscopic realization of a granular gas, you might say. I take granular particles, I give energy to them till they behave like gases, and I can see this kind of weird effects if I keep them just away from thermal equilibrium. All right, fine, I gave you one example. Let's again come back and look at something else. Okay, sorry. Now you are used to solving differential equations. That is one of the first things you learn, and I spent a whole semester learning how to solve specific differential equations in my undergrad. I think it was nearly 2, because we needed to learn to deal with polynomial solutions, specific type of solutions for specific problems, and so on. But the crux is that the type of problems we learn to solve tend to be linear equations. You have higher derivatives, but you always they're at the single power. Like this is a standard kind of equation that you'd get, that you have some kind of acceleration which is driven by the velocity and the position, and it is the whole process is being driven by some external force. Is someone's audio on? Okay, never mind. So now this is a example of the example all of us know. This is an example of a harmonic oscillator, where the harmonic oscillator is being driven by an external force or external field. You also have Laplace's equation, where you have an external charge distribution, and you want to determine phi. Remember that these are all linear equations. Linear because you are not dealing with phi square. You're not dealing with phi square or phi to the power some fractional number. You're dealing with just phi. And this and because we are dealing with only linear solutions, we can often take some ansatz or solutions, assume some solutions, and then we can correct them to find out what the actual solution is. Remember this, these are all linear equations, and because they are linear, the solutions can be relatively easily found. Please this is just one method how you come to the solution. Let's take a simple example of the Green's function. I suppose most of you would have heard of Green's function when you were doing electrodynamics. That is where I first heard the term. You might hear it somewhere else as well, but let's use the electrodynamics example so that everybody is on the same ground. You're given an equation where some potential, because the potential varies according to some field or some charge distribution. You know the charge distribution in detail, and you want to figure out what the potential looks like. So one type of way you can solve it is say that, all right, I don't want to solve for the whole charge distribution. I'll consider that the whole charge distribution is made of small discrete charges, delta functions. I'll solve it for one of these delta functions, and then I can just generalize the whole thing to phi. The solution for the single delta function is known as the Green's function, and it is from this Green's function that you can construct phi. So I don't want to go into the details of how you come to this. You can find it on any electrodynamics book, but the idea is this, that you can solve it and find a Green's function if the rho allows it, and depending on the dimensions, depending on which coordinate systems you're working with, the G will look different. But you can find a G, and if you have found a G, you can theoretically find out the phi given the rho. Look what the relation looks like. Phi is related to rho by a Green's function, but this also is of only single order. It's a linear function. So you can generalize it to say that, okay, my observable x of t is some function of the force that I give on the system related by some correlation function which we call chi. This chi can be the Green's function. This chi can be the susceptibility, anything. But look what chi is doing. It is linearly relating the driving force of the field to the observable or the effect. So this is a linear relation, and these kind of solutions are, and this is why chi is known as a linear response function or the susceptibility, because it basically defines what it does. It linearly relates the force to the observable, the field to the effect. But this only forms a very small part of our physical world. Life inherently is not linear. A lot of nonlinear processes take place throughout our life. And a great example is life itself. My boss is very fond of saying this line often: life is a nonlinear process ending in death. And if you think about it, our body is extremely nonlinear. You eat your breakfast every day. You are not hungry for a few hours. That does not mean that if I eat twice the breakfast, I'll stay full for another twice that amount of time. Because these are nonlinear, our body functions according to some rhythms. There are many nonlinear processes involved. If the concentration of any one kind of substance is more than required, the body will fight back against it. Now, it is not a bad thing to be nonlinear. If there are nonlinearities, there is often scope for self-correction or self-organization. Before I joined, or when I joined my lab, this is what large portion of the work on the lab revolved around. That is, if you allow a system to evolve with friction or nonlinear dissipative forces, does it show self-organization or not? I'm not going to talk about that because I honestly did not work in that area. But it is true that granular media show many nonlinear effects, and we may not understand them all, but we exploit them nonetheless. I'll show you a few examples, and maybe you'll appreciate the fact that you know a lot about granular materials. It's just that you haven't realized how weird they are. So I showed you in the initially how the granular system can behave like a gas provided you give it enough energy. A granular system can also behave like a liquid. You listen to Bulbul ma'am's talk on in the precision, and you have some idea, all of you have some ideas about what's going on, but let's go walk through basic by basic. I'm saying that a granular system can behave like a liquid. Can any one of you just give me an example that you can think of where it acts like a liquid? Just one or two guesses, I'll wait. Ognivo Datta says sand. That's an example of a granular material, but I'm asking for where does it behave like a liquid? Like what property are, okay, I have Professor RC, you can pour it. Yes, that is a very good example of why you can say that granular materials behave like liquids. Because it can pour, you can pour it into containers of various sizes and shapes. You can buy salt you can buy a salt packet that has a certain shape, and you can pour that salt into any container that you like. As long as it has enough volume, it will hold your salt. So the granular materials show the property that, like a liquid, that it can take the shape of the container you're pouring it in. It is because it can also flow from one container to another. It is relatively easy to transfer granular materials from one system to another. You just let it flow. However, there is one small difference. In liquids, the flow is determined, whether a liquid will flow or not, is determined by its viscosity. If it's too viscous, it cannot flow. In granular systems, this is now being replaced by its friction. And frictional flows have been exploited by us for many years, many centuries. A very small example that you might see every week in your area, if there's a construction going on, is piling of sand. The lorry comes, brings sand, dumps it in front of the work site that it has to work on. If this was like a liquid, the sand pile would all flatten down and the sand would spread all across your locality. But no, because of friction between the grains, the sands form a pile of a very specific angle, and this remains stationary. Now, this angle that the pile forms is just related to its frictional coefficient. Theta is related to mu by mu equal to tan theta. Simple as that. Now, this friction, now because it's a non-linear system, it's a dispersive system, it's a non-equilibrium system, external fields now play a very important role in how the system behaves. It is not a big jump of argument to say that whatever properties I'm seeing of granular media, friction will play a very large role in that. And I'll show you some. So one property that you have is nonlinear stress. I'll show you the calculation for it, but this is an example which most of you might have seen. Most of you might have seen an hourglass. Hourglass can be built very accurately where the time of flow is fixed, and hence hourglasses are often used as for competitions or as showpieces. But here, keep in mind, if this was actually a liquid, as the level of the liquid went down, the pressure on top of it would drop, and hence the flow of it would drop. So the last drop would take infinitely long to fall from the top plane to the lower plane. But in case of a hourglass, if you can make the angle of the hourglass greater than the angle that the friction can support, and as long as the opening is wide enough such that there is no jamming between the grains, your sand will flow at a near constant rate. So this shows you that the pressure on top of this that is controlling the flow downwards is not linear with height. This is taken to a great advantage of when we build silos to store grains in. If so a dam, if you think of it, because the stress of water increases linearly with height, a dam's base is much thicker than at the top. On the other hand, silos are made of few layers of metal or bricks, and they have more or less the same uniform density throughout, and they can be built very tall using very little material. And this is only possible because the stress does not grow linearly with height. I'll show you a small calculation as to how this stress actually behaves. So this model of stress propagation is known as the Jansen's model. It's pretty simple. I'll show you how it's done. So you have a column of a granular media within a certain cylinder. You come to a cross section of it at a certain height or a certain depth z. The pressure or the stress on the top surface is given by sigma zz, and at the bottom surface is sigma zz plus dz. So because showing you how the stress changes with height. At the walls of this cylinder, the radial stress sigma rr is responsible for friction, and gravity is now pulling the whole thing down. So if you write the force equation, it is very simply that you have the change in sigma zz, the change in sigma zz over a certain height z multiplied by its area. This is a force, is equal to the force given by gravity and minus the force due to the friction. Here is the main difference between a liquid and a granular media. In a liquid, this term mu would not exist. And if the liquid is stationary, there would be a term for viscosity, but that would be zero because the liquid is not moving. In a liquid, however, sigma rr is equal to sigma zz. Stress is equal in all directions. But in a granular media, we assume that a sigma rr is some constant times sigma zz. It can be more, it can be less, depends on the material you work. Now, if you solve this equation, you'll find that sigma zz is this kind of exponential solution. It saturates very fast depending on the value of lambda. Lambda is a characteristic length set by the various factors that you're working with. How wide the drum is, what is the friction of the grain you're working with, what is the value of this K you're working with, and so on. But it saturates nonetheless. And because of this, because the stress does not grow linearly, and the stress saturates very fast, we can make silos extremely large using very little material and with no need to change the thickness as it's going down in height. Like a liquid, a granular material can show convection as well. Convection in a liquid is seen when you apply some heat, and because of this thermal agitation, you have convective flows. In granular media, you also have convective flows. But before you come to that, let me give you an example of where you have seen this every single time. Are you fond of chips? I am. The first thing that you notice when you open up a packet of chips is it's full of air. The second thing that you might notice is that all the bigger chips seem to be on the top and the smaller chips at the bottom. Why is it so? If the machine is putting chips inside the packet and the chips are all randomly sized, shouldn't all chips be of the same size? Why do you get the bigger ones at the top and the smaller ones at the bottom? The answer to this is granular convection. But rather than tell you what happens, let me show you a small video. Sorry. Not used to this. Okay. So this is a simulation of a granular convection. Just keep in mind that this is a very large solid placed in a bed of small grains. Now I give it some kind of energy, and in granular convection, you set up granular convection by shaking the thing. And and you have instinctively done this when you're trying to get your fries from your chanachur packet. You shake it till the bigger pieces come up. And this is a small representation of what's going on. If you shake the system, the bigger particle moves. In the space created below it, the smaller particles can come in and now sit. And as time goes on, more particles collect, and a bigger particle, it might be heavier even, is pushed up simply by the interaction of the grains, smaller grains. This is known as the Brazil nut effect. And this is exactly why the shaking of, so when the chips are laid in the packet, in the convection line itself, there is a period where they are brought over and shaken vigorously so that the bigger chips come on top. The journey they take in large time in transports also causes external shaking. And this brings the bigger chips on the top. And this ensures that whenever somebody opens the packet, they will always find the bigger chips on the top. Now, again, let's come to something that you have worked out for yourself. You might know this model. This is this kind of linear chain of springs. This model is so useful that we have understood sound propagation and heat propagation in solids through it. That is the idea of phonons. You can solve, basically you can calculate the force due to the displacement, and you can calculate what the dispersion relations would be, and you get in a linear chain of atoms, you get two kinds of modes known as the optical and acoustic mode. This forms the basis of our understanding of energy transfer in solids. And it is helped by the fact that we can model them as springs, and the displacement between two, and the force due to the displacement is F equal to Kx. Again, this is a linear system. Now let's come to what happens in granular system. How does sound propagate, say, in a bucket of sand? So this is a linear chain of balls. So each of them are compressed, and now sound can pass through all of them. What if there was a small gap in between the two? If there was a gap, the sound would come into one ball, come across air. There would be no channel between one ball and the other, and no sound could transfer. Effectively, you've created a small vacuum by just removing the compression. The other problem that arises is that when you're dealing with compression of materials, the force is not linear. If you're talking about contact mechanics, the force grows as x to the power 3/2. This was calculated by Hertz, the same person we have named the frequency unit after. So this makes two things very clear, that in a granular system, the forces are not linear. So your propagation is going to be very odd and very dispersive. And it is and sound can only propagate if the system is well compressed. So if you want if you want sound to transfer faster, you'd have to compress the material more. This is a interesting picture that I found, that instead of say a linear chain of atoms, you can have a 2D array. And because the system is so nonlinear, if you change how the array is formed, say that you have spheres made of steel surrounding a sphere made of Teflon, or steel spheres surrounding steel spheres, Teflon spheres surrounding a Teflon sphere, or Teflon sphere surrounding a steel sphere. Just by changing the material's mass or the stiffness, the kind of wave that propagates changes drastically. This is helped by the fact that the system is so nonlinear to its nonlinear. The sound propagation in granular systems is very different from sound propagation in solid systems or atoms or whatever we are working with. This is the paper I took this picture from. If you're interested, you can have a look at it. I like reading it very much. I was only reading it yesterday. But now you have every right to ask me, so what? What did we learn? You talked for so long and you talked about so many things. What is your point? Fair question. I should be succinct with what I'm sharing with you. First point, when you're dealing with granular system, these are non-equilibrium systems. Keep that in mind, and many things will then seem clear to you that, okay, yeah, it's a non-equilibrium system. There must be some external field that's on the system which is due to which I'm seeing these properties. They show nonlinear properties. Just because you apply a force of this strength does not mean you'll get an effect of that strength as well. So you should keep that in mind. But the best part of it, which really appealed to me, is that because of these two properties, you can see very interesting effects, and from which you can derive very interesting physics. And more often than not, these are very good applications as well. But then you can ask me very straightforwardly, all right, fine, all this information that you've told me, I could have just looked up the net. I could have just read a book. Why are you talking to me? What are you going to add? What have you been doing? Again, it's a fair question. So I'll just share a couple of points with you. See, we understand any physical phenomena via observation. And our understanding of any physical phenomena is slightly, you might say, shorthanded. So we can only see the effect, and then we reconstruct it back to the cause. You might have heard a similar thing when you're talking about when you were studying magnetism. We do not really see magnetic field lines. We do not see what the magnetic field is doing. What we can do is measure the field at a point by some interaction, and then we can reconstruct what the magnetic field lines look like and what the field looks like and what the source is doing. It is true for any physical, it is true for any experiment, it is true for any physical phenomena. We try to reconstruct back the cause by seeing the effects, and then we try to understand what's going on. It is the same kind of approach that I had to follow in angular materials. So simply put, I studied collisions. I studied collisions of a hard object in sand, and I studied a bit of a crater formation. And then I thought that, okay, that problem's a bit complicated. Let me make it a bit more simpler. I'll just bounce a ball on a plate and see what happens. Simple ideas. Collisions make sense. I can study the collision. I can see what the collision's doing. Great. Why did I go into crater formation? Craters are a very important part of planetary sciences. Like, if you have a picture of a planet, you can tell by the number of craters on it what the activity on it was like. You can tell by the size of the crater what kind of impactors are falling on it. And you can construct the history of this planet to a certain extent. And why crater formation in granular media? Because I can work with any kind of grains, and I can prepare different kind of packings. I can control many parameters of this planetary surface. I have that much control over my system. But you can ask me a very simple question at this point. But craters in space, they are formed by impactors. These surfaces are huge, your impactors are huge, they're moving so fast. You can't do those on labs. Those numbers are just too high. Again, you are correct. I cannot reach those numbers. But you see, luckily for us, craters are not measured by these numbers alone. Whenever we are dealing with systems where there are lots of forces, we try to come up with dimensionless quantities that gives us a ratio of these forces. In the case of collisions, we are comparing the velocity of the projectile to the gravitational forces. So this dimensional quantity is known as a Froude number. And you might have, some of you who have worked in fluid mechanics might have come across this number as well. So if this number is what we are having to deal with, it makes more sense, because you see in craters of various sizes and shapes, which is being determined by the impactor's energy levels, this number tends to belong from 100 to 10 to the power 6, 100 to a million. So as long as I can do experiments on Earth where I keep this, my Froude number is between 100 to a million, the results I get, I should be able to correlate back to what I see in space. Turns out we can do even better. So this is a image of the crater formation lab in NASA. Here you have this long channel which can be bent at various angles, and you can accelerate a particle at near vacuum to nearly 1 kilometer per second. Because your particle has very high density, and density which you can control, and it's very small, you can reach Froude numbers of nearly 10 to the power 7. This is an order of magnitude greater than what you get in space. On the other hand, you can do experiments on your own in your house, take a ball, take a bucket of sand, and just drop it. In this case, where you're just dropping the ball due to gravity, the Froude number is around 10. This is an order of magnitude even lesser than the one you get in space. So in our labs, we can study crater formation to a greater detail than we could have done in space, because we have 2 orders of magnitude on either side. There is one tiny problem. See, last talk, Shashwata talked about how stars can form due to many other effects, such as you might have, turbulence, you might have gravity-dominated processes and all that. But there seems to be some other forces just apart from gravity that's there that helps in forming stars. This kind of analogy is also true for planets. If you start from a gas, gravitational collapse may not be always correct enough for a planet to form. There was a paper recently that showed us that even electrostatic attraction between these interplanetary gas can help form planets, because they get these interplanetary medium into a certain density that then can form larger and larger clumps due to gravity. So here's the issue, that when I'm working in the laboratory with this granular media, there's nothing holding the grains together apart from gravity. So good, I have a surface that's dominated by gravity. However, when you're dealing with planets in outer space, and they don't have an atmosphere, they are bombarded by lots of radiations, different kind of processes, which makes the soil very electrostatically charged. Now you have charge distribution on the soils, and they can clump together. But you do not see granular mediums sticking to each other. How do I do that? But some of you might already know the answer to this. I know when grains stick to each other, sands on the beach stick to each other, the water must be doing something, and you're absolutely correct. That is the route we took. So when you wet sand, a cohesion is generated. The surface tension holds these individual grains together. Now, depending on how much water has permeated into the granular system, you can study many kinds of problems. Like if you have a sand that's fully wet, now you can study how anchors bind onto river beds. In this kind of system, the sand is completely wet. If the sand or the granular system is slowly being wetted, we can study how riverbanks break apart. Like as the water gets in, the thing becomes unstable and it falls apart. The region I worked in was this. If you have heard of hydrophobic sand, look at this. There's a layer of air around the sand which is not being able to escape, and which gives this sand its very shimmery appearance. And because of this sand seems to be standing up in water with a very peculiar shape. This kind of sand is known as hydrophobic sand. This is easily available in toy markets. So what happens is, these grains are treated by a chemical that repels water, hence the name hydrophobic. Because they are hydrophobic, a continuous chain, a film forms over the surface, which is an air-water interface. The air is trapped at the surface of these grains and not allowed to escape. This film now surrounds the whole granular structure and gives it some form of rigidity, which it would not have had if the water went in. So now you can give some kind of rigidity to your granular system just by using this property. Now, because it's rigid, that means some extra energy has to be applied to break this. So the question you can start to ask is, I know how a crater forms in dry sand. If I add this energy cost to it now, what effect should I see? Like, should anything become very clear? Will it be subtle effect? Will it be very observable effects? What should I be able to see? So I did a very simple study. This was a project that I did for my coursework over a period of a year. So I would drop a steel ball of a specific size onto a bed of hydrophobic sand, and I would measure the shape of the crater. I would measure how big its radius is, how deep it is, and I'll show you the results. We studied 3 different cases. I had dry sand, then I slowly poured water over it so that a uniform film could be formed, and then I attached the whole system to a vacuum pump so that this small air film would be pulled up, and then when you don't have air anymore into this thing, this rigidity should again disappear, and we should get back what you and naively you'd say that if there's no rigidity anymore, it should behave like the dry sand again, albeit now it's completely wet. And you would be correct. Here I plotted the depth of the crater as a function of the drop height of my projectile. And this had been done earlier, and we found out that the results corresponded to earlier results, where it would grow as a power law with an exponent d proportional to h to the power 1/3. However, as soon as you went to hydrophobic sand, this exponent shifted. It now became half. So this is a dramatic effect. Great. We have seen something, and we have established that the film does have some effect. The radius was even more funny. Earlier, the radius of the dry sand would grow as a power 1/4. In case of the wet hydrophobic sand, it would initially rise and then become more or less constant. So it would seem like initially the ball is able to make a wider and wider hole, but once it has reached more or less a certain amount of certain radius, the crater does not grow in size anymore. It only grows in depth. So what conclusions did I draw? So the air water film does add a considerable cost to the energy required to form the crater, and which is evident from the change in the power laws. And we saw that R is proportional h to the power 1/4 for dry sand and nearly constant for hydrophobic sand. Unfortunately, I was not able to get the radius of the craters formed in evacuated sand, because as soon as I tried to remove the projectile, the crater would collapse. The crater would collapse from the sides. If time permits, I'll talk a bit more about why these scaling laws are important, or what kind of odd arguments you can come out from it. So this is the first project I did as a part of my coursework. Then I enter my PhD, and I start my own problem. As I said, I said that this problem is complicated. There are so many grains. I'd have to work out the mechanics of all the grains. I prefer an easier problem. Then I can study it in a bit more detail. So I said that, all right, I'll take a plate and I'll bounce a ball on it, and I'll see how that ball comes to rest. Experiments generally involve doing it in a very large plate where you can ignore edge effects and other effects because of the large size. I said that we'll do it for a small plate, just to see small plate. In this case, collision, the intensity of collision is very easy to measure. You have heard of the coefficient of restitution epsilon, which you have learned from high school, which is the ratio of the outgoing velocity to the incoming velocity. And it is naive to expect that if you now have a smaller plate instead of a very large plate, you would expect that because of the small size, I should start to see some effects into my observation. But before I get into that, let me ask you a question. And let me show you what I did in the experiment. So we had a plate and I had a ball, and I would drop it. I made this plate and ball into an electrical switch so that every time there would be a contact, I'd get a voltage spike, and I just record this voltage spike. It's a very simple mechanism, and it's very accurate too. As long as your system can detect these voltage spikes, you can more or less do these experiments on a tabletop. So you see this coupling medium. Initially, I just use a single sheet of paper to insulate it from the optical table. Later on, I changed this media to some other medium, but the results of them were not that great, so I'm not showing you them here. Because I thought that vibrations would play a role in how this plate is behaving, we built a clamping structure into which we can place the plate and we would put screws in and tighten it in place so that this vibrations from the sides would die out. And then we again measured what happened. So we are making very simple measurements. I can only measure, I am simply letting the ball drop onto the plate and measuring when it makes contact. And so between the time between two pulses tells me how long the ball has been in the air, and from that I construct what is the velocity of the ball during impact and out after impact. So it's a very, the protocol for this experiment is extremely simple. And this is a picture of the one of the plates that I used. So I used multiple plates, but this is one of the plates. And you can see that it's bigger than the ball that we are doing the experiment with, but it's massively large. It's around, so the ball is around 12 mm in diameter, and this plate is around 90 mm. Now, before I go into showing you my results, let me just ask you a question. I showed you what epsilon is, the coefficient of restitution. It is a measure of what your inelasticity in the problem is. Now I ask you this question, that what would epsilon as a function of velocity look like? Most of you would have understood from high school that the epsilon is considered to be a constant. It's less than 1. It could be 1 for a perfectly elastic collision, but it's a constant less than 1 for a given material or two bodies colliding. Now, this was the idea that was given by Newton. On the other hand, Raman, C.V. Raman in 1930, followed by Zener in 1941, they calculated, Raman did the experiment, Zener did the theoretical calculation, and found that the epsilon is actually a function of velocity that which grows towards 1 as the velocity goes towards 0. However, both of these have a problem. You see, if the epsilon is less than 1, the ball will come to a rest, but there will be infinite collisions. And in this model, as the ball comes to rest, the epsilon keeps growing and growing until it reaches 1. So this would also take infinite collisions to come to rest. However, both of these processes say that there will be infinite number of collisions, but within a finite time. This is realistically not seen till date. This kind of process where a system comes to rest via inelastic collisions, infinite collisions in finite amount of time, is known as the inelastic collapse. It is under great debate whether this happens at all or not in nature. But this is what the theory tells you. What did my experiment show? My experiment showed very weird things. So I could calculate the theoretical line for various thicknesses, and I found that if I had a very thick plate, my observations would always be below this line. If it was for intermediate thickness plate, for some reason it magically seems to align with it, but it seems to deviate at lower velocities. And if you have very thin plates, it seems to only match at the lower velocities and not at all at the initial velocities. Weird? It does not match with your theory, but does not match in a, what can I say? It's wrong, but it's not wrong in a consistent way. And the other odd thing that I saw was that most of these collisions, or the collisions that we are seeing, as the ball comes to rest, it would just disappear at 10 to the power minus 3 meters per second. As if the ball reached a velocity of 10 to the power minus 3 meters per second and said, I won't bounce anymore. And I thought that was weird. But then I realized that when we are talking about those energies, 10 to the power minus 3 meters per second, if I calculate the energies, and these seem to be almost equal to the surface tension energies that you'd see So there are more dissipative forces which are extremely weak, but they determine how your ball comes to rest at very low velocities. So you do not have infinite collisions. You have a finite number of collisions till you come to rest because of extra dissipative forces in your system. I have a question. Okay, I'll answer later. So this was when I was bouncing a ball on a plate. Now I added a spring to the end of the ball and let the ball bounce on its ball on one end, and the spring would be on the top. Now what would the spring do? The spring would elongate and compress, and it would make the ball move a bit up and down. The effect of this was even more extraordinary. Suddenly, instead of a very thin band gradually become wider, you have oscillatory bands in your data, and these bands simply keep widening and widening until you reach very low velocities. The other thing that you can see here is that if you see closely, epsilon equal to 1 represents a collision which is completely elastic. But I have data where the epsilon is greater than 1. And the other thing that is weird, that in a thick plate where you don't have a spring on the ball, you only see this at very low velocities. And initially you hardly have any at all. But in case of this spring, they are from the very beginning. And the number of these collisions increase very largely as you go towards lower velocities. So this is the epsilon v diagram, scatter diagram. I said that, okay, let me look at the distribution of this. So if I look at the probability distribution, you see that for a plate without a ball, you have a sharp peak at some value of epsilon. But for the spring ones, there's a very smooth fall at very high epsilon values. So we call these collisions superelastic collisions, where the epsilon is greater than 1. And then I told you I used the clamping structure and I redid my experiment, and I asked myself if these superelastic collisions are related to vibrations, and since my clamping structure stops vibrations, this number of these superelastic collisions should go down if I clamp the plates, and which it turns out is true. For the very thick plate of 20 mm, there's hardly any difference. Both of them are the same level. But for the thinner plates, you see that if you have a clamp plate, the probability of getting these superelastic collisions out of all the collisions that you have done is much lower than the probability if it was a free plate that is unclamped. If I divide this number by this number, and I call that a ratio, and I plot that the ratio as a function of thickness, I see that this ratio falls down as you go towards thicker plates. So I'd expect that a very thick plate, that is why you won't see this at very large plates, because what happens is if you have a very thick plate, the energy of the small projectile, it is just not enough to make it vibrate very much. So you don't have these vibrations, and you don't see these superelastic collisions. 1 minute. The theories. No. So after I made these observations, then we tried to come up with a very crude model as to what might be causing it. We had a very good argument that the vibration set up in the plate because of the bounces is what's causing the superelastic collisions. Then I asked myself, can we model it in some way? So I'll not share the math here. I'll just give you a small idea about how we went about the modeling. So we set these 3 simple rules. So the ball initially falls on the plate, and you can calculate the amount of collisional energy that is developed because of the ball's velocity and the plate's thickness and all these parameters. But instead of all the energy being extracted into the ball, only a fraction of it is, and a certain portion of it is left in the plate, which makes the plate vibrate up and down. The stored energy remains in the plate, and because the plate is vibrating, is losing energy. The more energy that is dumped into a plate, the more it will vibrate, the more energy it will lose. When the ball comes and bounces on this plate in the next bounce, it sees these vibrations can add to this vibration energy can be added back into the ball. But keep in mind that this level of this energy is extremely small. So initially, the ball between 2 bounces has a very large time period, and hence it does not give much energy because most of the energy is gone by the time the ball comes back. But as the ball comes to rest, there is very small time difference between these 2 collisions, and hence the energy can remain in the plate. And as soon as the ball comes in for the next bounce, a large chunk of this energy can come into the ball, and hence you see superelastic collisions. So we ran a simulation where I set these simple rules up, and I told the ball to bounce, and I found that apart from a few mistakes, this matched very closely with the experimental data that we had. So the experimental data is on the left, and on the right, the red is the simulation data. Of course, there are some mistakes. This is an extremely crude model, but it is able to predict the superelastic collisions, and it seems to line up pretty well with what we are seeing. We have sent this paper for review. I hope it gets accepted. That will be my first paper. So what did we learn in this experiment? That vibrations play a very important role in the bouncing of a ball on a plate, especially if the plate is not very large compared to that of the ball. These vibrations are being set up and can lead to superelastic collisions at very low velocities. And this is the most important point. In a single collision, you do not expect such superelastic collisions. And this is a byproduct of the previous bounce's energy coming to later bounces. So over the 2 years, I did these 2 projects. And while I was finishing this experiment, the great COVID came about and there was a lockdown and we were stuck in our institutes or had to go back home. But luckily, we used the time really well. So a team led by my professor Shankar Ghosh and other Professor Arnab Bhattacharya of TIFR, consisting of the team of Dr. Emroz Hossain, who became a doctor a few months ago, and my lab mates Harsh and Shauman, we did a study of N95 masks, and we found out a very interesting result that got taken up by the press. I just wish that I had given them a better photo of me, but that's the way it is. If now, I'm sorry I could not talk to you about masks in great detail today, but if you are interested, I'll send over the slides to Ognivo, and you can visit these hyperlinks to know much about our research or about masks in general. Most of the things that I told you today, I took from this book, and it's an excellent textbook. If you want to know a bit about granular systems, this is a great book to start on. And with that, thank you. I had a great time telling you about my research, and I can take questions now.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. So we have one question. Okay. What are these 3 theories?
Which theories is he talking about?
Harimon, please unmute your microphone.
Okay, can you go back to your slides, because you don't have the slide number, so I cannot tell that
No,
number.
can you just give me an idea? I'll go back.
So yeah, so yeah. Wait. Yeah, no, forward. Now you have to go forward. Little bit more. No, forward direction. और थोड़ा. There are graphs. No, you are going. I think you are going backward.
Sorry.
This was about when you said that your experimental results were wrong, but not consistently wrong. Those 3
Okay.
lines of the data.
Okay. I'll cover that. That's relatively easy to tell. Yeah. So keep this in mind that Raman. The slide is after this. I'll just give this in mind. So Raman and Zener came up with how epsilon varied as a function of velocity. All right. And this kind of graph, we know the formula for that. We know how to calculate it. And this kind of line, it changes for, the plate thickness that you're working with. So what I did so what you're seeing here is that I took this theory and I put it in, and I used 3 different kind of plates, 20 mm thick plate, 5 mm thick plates, and 2 mm thick plates. And this is the experimental data that you see the scatter, and the thick line that you see, that is the theory of Zener that has been modified for this plate. You see that Zener's theory fails in one way for the thicker plate, it fails in another way for the 5 mm plate, and it fails in quite another way for the 2 mm plate.
So while the size of ball was same?
Yeah, the ball was the same. I only changed the plate.
Okay. And can you tell why this like there is a bumps in this green color in data, 2 mm data?
I don't know why the bumps are there, right? I'm trying to understand what goes on. So
Okay.
a reason why there might be a lot of noise in this data as well is I showed you that how I'm collecting the data, right? Like I have this kind of electrical switch, and as soon as the voltage spikes, I measure a contact has taken place. But in the 2 plate, because it's so thin, we found out that the contact is not very good. It often just degrades, or maybe there's a momentary contact, suddenly the contact is lost. So you have lots of spots where you don't have information. So I suppose that has to some extent that might be the reason why you're seeing such kind of odd behavior. But if you look at the general points that you see, the clumps of points, they seem to be above the theoretical value at higher velocities and matches up at the lower values.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, Shomendra, please go ahead.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Shatyanuda. It is really a nice talk. So I have basically two very basic questions. So at
Wait,
the
I'll just write it down just in case. Go ahead.
yeah, at the very beginning of the talk, you told that you are studying a very dissipative system, right? Instead of
Yes.
a conservative system, you are studying a dissipative system. So
Yes.
from a microscopic point of view, where does the energy go? I mean, I don't understand from the microscopic view. I mean, you should have the energy conservation, right? Otherwise,
No, you see that I don't know about the microscopic picture, like what's going on and all that. But if you consider that, I'm saying that suppose you consider these are like collisions are between hard spheres that cannot compress, but when they collide, they dissipate energy, maybe via sound, maybe via heat.
okay.
They dump it into the system. They out of themselves into the system.
Okay. So my next question is when you are when generally we are studying fluid, so we have some Euler equation or Navier-Stokes equation. Navier-Stokes equation is of course a nonlinear equation. So what is the analog of Navier-Stokes equation in granular medium? I mean, we should have some differential equation, right? Otherwise,
Actually, I did not show you because I would not know much in detail and did not want to say anything wrong. But the thing is, I showed you like a granular media, you can take it to very different states, right? Depending on the energy input into it. So there exists a kind of thing called fluidized sand. There are videos of this on Facebook. What happens is that, sorry, YouTube. What happens is that if you take a sand bath, a container of sand, and feed air from underneath it or vibrate at a very specific frequency, the sand can then start to behave like a fluid, and then it will show you properties like buoyancy, like flows, and all that. So depending on the amount of energy you're giving the granular system, it will show behavior. So these Navier-Stokes equations and all those fluid equations that you see, they can be seen provided that the external energy that you give into this dissipative system is of a certain type.
okay. So you do have some differential equations, right? Otherwise, it is a bit problematic to study such system. At least
Yeah,
mathematics.
you cannot, like, if I had a column of granulars, if I had say a box of sand or a box of salt, I would not know basically like what equation should I write for it to evolve, right? Because of the friction of the grains, these grains are now static. They are not moving. They are not doing anything. They will not move until I give some energy to the system. And when I give energy to the system, I can tell you a bit about, okay, this is how it's going to behave.
Okay,
So that's the point.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have some question. Shayan Shamanto, he said, just a clarification, if possible. I think I missed it. What is the connection between first part of the talk on granular material and then collusion in the second part?
Okay, so the idea is very simple, that I studied my work. I started my work on granular system. Like my first project was on collisions on granular media. So before I went into studying what happens when I collide something on a granular media, this is where I came from. So my idea was that in granular media, it's a dissipative system, right? So you see you give some energy to the system and see how it behaves. So collisions are one kind of that. that you give energy at a certain point or over a very small space in a very concentrated way. So that was my area. That is why initially I started collisions. You can give energy to the system in many different ways. As I mentioned, you can take the whole container of your granular system and just vibrate it at a certain frequency. Here you're giving energy to the system and it behaves in a different way, and you can study those. I'm currently working on something in those lines. So basically the idea is that in a granular system, if you want to study it, you have to give it energy and see how it behaves. That's the whole idea. Was I clear?
Okay, so we have some question from Achyuda. He
Okay.
say, how do you distinguish a granular material and non-granular one? Is there something analogous to order parameter? First question. And second, he say, wait, does the shape of projectile also matter? I believe if a shape.
Okay, I'll come to the shape of the projectile in case of,
Okay.
is he asking in case of my sand experiment or my plate experiment?
Achyuda, please unmute.
And
Okay, I'll come to that. So granular media,
I guess Atreo says plate. Yeah, Atreo writes plate experiment.
shape in plate.
The plate experiment, that's what he writes. Can you first answer Atreo's first question, maybe?
Okay, the idea of granular media, right? So granular media are classified by various different things. You're often talking about the shape of the grains, the size of the grains, and all that. But the main idea is that if it has certain properties, then you say that all right, this is what you call granular media. So the size of the grains, what we are looking for are effects like this, that it should be a dispersive system. It should be made of individual grains which are not connected by any material, like you do not have springs or anything. These are individual grains which are just interacting with each other via contact. And that is, I think, the biggest kind of definition you can put on it, that I have individual shaped grains which are interacting with each other. There's no force as such, they are just in contact, and that is how they're interacting. That would be how I'd say the thing works. Regarding Atreo's second question, the shape of the projectile does not matter that much when you're dealing with, crater formation. In the initial energies, the initial penetration, it does matter. But there are papers that show that once you cross a certain threshold, it does not matter at all. You'll always recover the power laws that you see. In case of the plate, though, the ball bounces on a plate because it has a very small point of contact, which gradually flattens and then it bounces back up, which is given by Hudson collision and all that. If I were to do the different shape projectile, it will do something else to the plate rather than just bounce off. If I used say a flat cube, it would bounce a couple of times before coming to rest because the whole surface of it would be in contact with the plate during collision. If I used a very sharp object like an arrowhead, it would pierce into the material or just bounce off. So there's that. I just use the ball on a plate because it is the easier thing to study. And I think somebody asked me something about the relations that I was talking about. Yeah, the Shayan Samanto asked, so basically no cohesive forces between the particles. Yeah, that is a good place to start.
Okay, so SC ma'am has some question. Please,
Go
SC
ahead.
ma'am.
No, I think I just had a comment, but if there are other questions, let's get to that. Are there other questions? Because I saw that there was a question from Shayan Shamanto, which was continuing to Atreo's question.
So basically no cohesive force between the particle
Yeah,
That
that's what I just saw. That I said that would be a
okay,
good
okay.
place to start.
Yeah, mine was just a comment based
go
on what Shomendra said. Okay, so Shayan Shamant asked this question. Continue with what Atreo asked. Is there an assumption that the plate ball is rigid, so nothing gets deformed? They just vibrate. After that, I'll ask Mike.
Rigid. So the kind of force that comes into this, the calculation of epsilon as a function of velocity, right? It assumes that due to the collision, some deformation takes place. Okay. But the deformation will again go away as soon as the material as soon as the ball bounces off it. So and I did these experiments over. So when you see this plot, these are like nearly 2000 bounces. Like I raise the ball up, I let it drop, and it would come to rest for nearly 2000 times before I view the scatter plots. After 2000 plots, and you saw the figure of the plate I showed you in the slide. This plate has undergone so many collisions over so many times, and there's hardly any effect on it due to the ball itself. So yeah, this was also studied in great detail by a German team, and they pointed out that if the materials are of sufficient thickness, if no matter how long you do these experiments, the data does not change and the plate does not deform, the surface does not deform that appreciably. So that is why I assume that most of the energy is left in the vibrations itself.
So two people have already raised your hand. Jim Bangali, go ahead.
My question is very basic. For example, when we model the fluid dynamics, তখন আমরা এটা decide করি যে we have basically continuous media because the scale of your individual particles in the fluids are very small compared to the region of velocity field we are talking about. In this case, that scale may not be very small, right? It's a mesoscopic kind
that
of.
is you have instinctive. If you knew this, it was great, or else you made a very good jump in logic. So
yeah,
if you see I'll go to I don't have a picture unfortunately, but let me try to make you see what I'm saying. So if you have this sand pile, right, and
right,
you let some grains just and because of the angle some grains just roll off, okay, it avalanches on the surface. If you were to take a snapshot from the side, you'd see that this layer of moving sand or layer of moving grain is maybe only 2 or 3 layers thick.
right.
Below the 2 or 3 layers, it's static. It's like a solid. Friction is holding it. So the length scales are not like very distinct. So like if you have one particle within 5 or maybe another 10 particles, you have liquid-like properties emerging. So this length scale, they are not very far apart.
Right. But what I'm trying to understand is, uh, uh, if you want to model, because many of the times what researchers do is they kind of try to model it in terms of some fluid, right? Like high viscous fluid.
Or a continuum media, I suppose.
Yeah,
that is the
exactly.
point.
That is the point.
So again,
But
this is another point that this comes about, that the Jansen's model I showed you, right? Like where
right,
the stress is, I show that it exponentially saturates. There it is there I've assumed it to be a continuous media, right? I'm taking sigma z like a continuous
correct,
function of the
correct,
depth.
correct.
So that this is another problem in granular media. In some scales, your assumption of a continuum media works. In some scale, in some problems, it does not.
Right.
Like for example, if you listen to Bulbul Madam's talk, she showed you the picture of force chains, right? If
Right.
you remember that? So what happens is that if you apply force on a granular media, it tends, instead of going like continuous fields, there tends to be very sharp lines via which the force transmits.
Right.
Now, if you had taken a continuum picture there, you would never get these lines. You would get like areas of stresses which would propagate. But in reality, when you do the experiment, when you take the photograph, you see these force lines coming up. So yeah, it's another problem that you do when you're dealing with granular material. You have to be careful about would my continuum assumption work here or would not, and that is a lot. That depends on a lot of the problem you're working with. So
So
sometimes,
basically when, yeah, yeah.
yeah. So you're saying basically
Basically when
sometimes
we
it
are,
works and sometimes it does not.
so basically when we are working with very, I would say very large region of this granular system,
Hmm.
then it's probably more towards continuous behavior, right?
Yeah, if you're working very large scales, if the stresses are more or less uniform throughout the media, then you can work with a continuum picture.
But in the microscopic scale, whatever fluctuations there is,
Hmm.
those things will largely contribute in granular case, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Like those will not die out.
Not really, no, not often.
So how do you deal with those fluctuations?
So often what happens is that maybe we do this fluctuation add up or not, again depends on what kind of system you're studying. I'm relatively new to this, so I'm not very much aware of exactly what happens, but maybe I can look
Okay,
into it and let you know.
okay, fine.
So Sayan Shamanta have on other question, then the plate would heat up, would not it make a different plate?
The temperature does not change much. Okay, so uh, we checked again that see the energies that is being dumped on the plate. No, these are extremely small. The rise in temperature due to these energies would be almost negligible. So if you have so often, so yeah, I do not think heat is a problem in my experiment. And the papers that I refer to when I started my experiment, some of them did thermal imaging of the plate while they were doing their experiment, and they said that there is a momentary spot where you have some heat-like effect, but it immediately dies out.
So Shaurodeep Sengupta have a question. I have one question about the super elastic collision. So
Okay.
if a ball leaves the plate with higher energy, higher final energy, then initial energy, where does the extra energy come from? Does it come from the lattice energy? I saw this happen uh, above a certain threshold velocity. Is that the minimum required to trap into the spring action of the lattice?
So is this a microscopic event that is happening, or is a macroscopic event that is happening? Is something that I have not looked into. I have assumed that these superelastic collisions that are happening below a certain velocity is a macroscopic thing. It is wholly related to the vibration of the plate. There was a paper very recently in 2020 that talked about that if I model the surface as a this kind of lattice, what would the epsilon look like? But he calculated for a very different velocity regime than ours, and he did not report any superelastic collisions as such. But again, his experiment, this is a theoretical paper, and it was a very different kind of calculation, because there again he assumed that a single collision was taking place and he was characterizing based on that. In my experiment, what I pointed out was that, let me come to a picture where it's clear. So these superelastic collisions that you're seeing happen below a certain velocity, at very low velocities. When the ball hits the plate, goes up for a very short period of time, and again comes and hits the plate. So when the ball bounces for the first time, it gives some energy to the plate, and the plate starts vibrating, and this energy slowly dies out. The ball again comes and hits the plate the second time, and if this, say, the plate vibration and the ball's contact is in sync somehow, the ball will now take the energy from the plate apart from just the collision energy. So now it has more energy than it would have had if the plate was not moving at all. And this might be why you see superelastic collisions. So my argument for superelastic collision is a completely macroscopic idea. I did not consider a lattice picture in any way. Yeah, that's my answer to that question.
Okay, so lack of time. So if anyone has any question, please feel free to mail Sattanuda, and I hand over the session to Ognivo. Please, Ognivo, go ahead.
Okay, Satyanoda, can you please stop sharing your screen? I just
Okay. Okay, no problem. Stop share. There's me.
ma'am, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we can start the interaction session.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much, Shottanu, for the fantastic talk. Now we are going to have the interaction session, and this is primarily for bachelor's and master's students at Presidency. You are welcome to stay if you want, but this will be mostly aimed to them, so that they get to interact a bit with their seniors and the kind of kind of work they're doing, and some other more personal kind of interaction. And we generally do this session in Bangla. Is that okay?
No issue, no problem.
May I interrupt?
Yes, please, Navanita.
Yes, Shubhrajyoti actually wanted to show us the new published newsletter. So
absolutely.
I was. Go ahead.
Yes, hello everyone. First of all, Satyananda, I really enjoyed your talk. I mean, it was amazing. And
I'll ask you why it was amazing later on, but okay, go ahead.
Yeah, the newsletter has been published for this year, and the students of our department, Presidency University, has been up to a lot in the last year. And the newsletter would update everyone on the same. And if you're interested, please take a look at it. It has already been posted in the physics past present group. So if you are a member, you